Well, no, I had to go to finish out the degree. Yeah, I went to Bogenhofen right after. Yeah. I don't even know who was in charge back then. Okay. Yeah, went to Bogenhofen for the language stuff. But. Yeah. Oh, no problem. Well, it wasn't a question of should. It was a matter of I had to do it to finish the degree because if you look at my diploma, it says graduated August 2011 because they wouldn't write out the diploma until I had gotten the credits from Bogenhofen. So. To this day, when I speak German to people, they know I was from Austria. Like instantly, they know.
Let me try one more time. There, that's perfect.
It's in the beard.
It's in the beard. Is it okay? Is it?
It's going to go back down when I start talking. I'm just going to lift my head up because it only catches if I put my head down. So.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Talk to the back row. Look down my nose at people.
So I'll. Tony and Elizabeth, I'll and Tony will have the same prayer, and Elizabeth will introduce us. And then we do the offering at the end. What's that? Oh, do you have it with me? I always put it on, especially when we have community events, because there's people that don't necessarily know who they are. I always think it's a good idea. So I have it. I picked up from Dr. Shaw. And Elizabeth, when you do the offering at the end before the Q&A, if you could also mention we'll have a short chapter meeting. So if there's people interested in supporting and helping with ATS, you're welcome to do that.
And for any further questions and stuff, I assume we're just going to go out there.
Well, we'll give enough time for the Q&A.
Okay.
And so don't feel rushed about that.
Okay.
Just when that's done, afterwards we'll have probably like a 15-minute meeting to discuss ATS chapters.
I gotcha. For those who are members of the ATS stuff.
Yeah,
I gotcha.
Good afternoon. I'm Michael Campbell. I teach here in the religion department here at Southwestern Adventist University. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon as this is our first lecture. Due to COVID, we didn't have any lectures in our lecture series last year, but now this year we've been able to kind of get that started again. And so as we're trying to do that, getting into the rhythm of things, here on the university, we've been asking people if you can, please wear your mask for indoor events. So we strongly encourage you to do that. Realize that's a sensitive subject, but if you can, please do that. And thank you for being here this afternoon. The Amethyst Theological Society is an international organization. We have various chapters in different parts of the country. This is our chapter for the Southwestern Union. And so we're able to have a series of different speakers. Some are close by. Our speaker today is one of those that may be quite familiar to many of you, as well as we have some that come from afar. And so whether near or far, we enjoy the opportunity to have people cover a range of topics that I hope and trust that you will find helpful for you. One thing I do want to alert you, we haven't had a meeting since we didn't have one last year. So those of you that would be interested in supporting or becoming active in the Adventist Theological Society, we'll have a short chapter meeting at the very end of our meeting, after our speaker, after the Q&A. So just anyone's welcome to participate. Of course, we want you to become members of the Adventist Theological Society. And you're probably asking, how do I become a member of the Adventist Theological Society? It's very simple. You can just go online to ATSJATS, jats.org, ATSJATS, or you can just Google Adventist Theological Society. There's an easy online member form, and you can sign up. And we'd love to have you be a part of the Adventist Theological Society. One nice benefit is by just becoming a member, for a nominal cost, you have the opportunity to subscribe to some great publications, great print resources that tell you kind of the world of Adventist scholarship, different things that are going on. There's an academic journal, there's a more popular version of that called Perspective Digest. Again, great resources for you. I've asked Tony Zbarszczuk, who's a librarian here on our campus. He's also the secretary of our ATS chapter, to have the opening prayer, followed by Elizabeth Bowser, one of our history professors, who who will introduce our speaker for today. He will speak. Now keep in mind, we will have some time for Q&A after the presentation. So be making some jots in your mind as to, hey, if I have a particular question that I'd like to have clarified, we'll have an opportunity. And so I always find that the Q&A is some of the most fun part of a lecture series. So thanks so much for being here, and without any further ado, Tony.
Dear Lord, we're gathered here today to listen and to learn, and hopefully to go away with something helpful and useful for our understanding of our past history. Thank you for the opportunity, and please bless the audience with listening ears and the speaker with the gift of understanding, clarity, and presentation. In your name, amen.
Good afternoon. Austin and I go way back. He started here the second year that I was teaching here, so he suffered cheerfully through my relative inexperience. But the upside was we got to eat hot, fresh bread during 7:30 classes, straight out of the bread maker. He went on from here. He graduated here in 2011. He went on to the University of Texas at Arlington and earned his PhD in 2019, and he's still there but now teaching. So we're very proud of him and his accomplishments. His area of studies include intercultural transfer, honor and violence in Renaissance Europe, the cult of saints, relics, and pilgrimage in medieval Europe. His dissertation, Cornflakes, God and Circumcision, John Harvey Kellogg and Transnational Health Reform, compares the health reform movements between Europe and America, with Kellogg as a conduit between them, and this is currently under review for publication with Anthem Press. So without further ado, Austin, I tell you, the Skittles in my office in that gumball machine just are not disappearing as quickly as they used to. I'm still not sure quite what to do about that.
Probably still the same ones from when I graduated.
Some of them may be.
Yeah.
But we're happy to welcome Austin to this auditorium and to hear about John Harvey Kellogg, one of the most colorful characters in Adventist history and indeed in U.S. history. Fit for translation, John Harvey Kellogg and Salvific Health Reform.
Afternoon, everyone. So I am very pleased to be here. Michael and I have been trying to get this to happen for 2 years, I think, because it happened right after I graduated, and you said, hey, let's try and get something together for me to do this, and then COVID hit, and we were all sequestered to our homes for about 2 years teaching from our desks. So I am very pleased to finally get the chance to lecture here. So two caveats before I begin. Some people have mistaked me for being what Michael is, which is an Adventist historian, a church historian, a historian of the Seventh-day Adventist religion. I'm actually not. You heard Beth introduce the areas of study that I kind of specialize in. It just happened that the dissertation topic I chose began to center itself around John Harvey Kellogg. And I went down the rabbit hole as far as his history was concerned. So while it may seem that I'm an Adventist historian, I don't really count myself among y'all's ranks. I'm just a historian of transnational history. But in writing a dissertation and trying to understand Kellogg's health reform movements and how he approached his ideas on health and the religious nature of his health reform movements, I had to study that portion of church history. So I guess what I'm saying that for is that I'm not a theologian by any stretch of the imagination, but historians tend to dabble in theology, as most of us do. So,
We'll take you on.
Oh, if you're offering, I'll work for the theology department, sure. I don't know how long you'll keep me there, but as Martin Luther said, God once spoke through the mouth of an ass, and perhaps he's about to do so again. So, fit for translation, John Harvey Kellogg and Salvific Health Reform. What on earth does Salvific Health Reform mean? This is kind of the lecture version of a paper that I'm developing for a conference coming up, which I've been told is postponed till the spring. So, but I thought this would be a fitting topic because how this paper really came about was a headline that came out in March that perhaps many of you were familiar with. Christianity Today, back in March, published this article saying many Adventists in Asia and Africa believe you must be vegan to be saved. This caused headlines. It made it all the rounds through Facebook, which produced colorful comments right and left from commentators who said, yes, this is what we should do, and others who said, where on earth is this coming from? So Christianity Today got basically took and summarized another scholarly article by Dwayne McBride and others. Dwayne McBride being is he technically a sociologist? Sociologist at Andrews University, called Health, Beliefs, Behavior, Spiritual Growth, and Salvation of Global Population of Seventh-day Adventists. So, in the findings, are they going to put this behind me?
They have
all right.
all three sides.
Okay. Just kind of. Anyways, in these findings, they discovered, if you look at the chart here, they discovered that the total population that they sampled, out of that total population, nearly 50% believed that the health message ensures salvation. That was the question they asked. In particular, if you look at how they divided it down the list, you can see that the strongest ones that agreed or strongly agreed with the health message ensuring salvation, you can see there, the Southern Asia, 80% of those surveyed agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. Where are some of the higher ones? The South Pacific, 58%. Southern Asia Pacific, 58%. West Central Africa, 58%. And then almost 60% for your Southern African and Indian Ocean. The lowest one is North America with 4.3%. However, there's two caveats in this paper. The first one, and these are their conclusions. Overall, the data show that globally more than 90% of the members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church see the church's health message as holistic, as integrating mind, body, and spirit. Adventist teaching emphasizes that spiritual discernment and understanding is enhanced by a healthy body and mind, and the data reported indicate that the members agree with this position. So nobody's really debating the fact that they believe the health message to be integral to spiritual growth of mind, body, spirit, and the holistic approach to medicine. To health reform. Now, this is the important caveat right here. The Adventist Church's fundamental belief, number 10, emphasizes both that salvation is through faith in Christ alone and that we, quote, we are given the power to live a holy life, i.e. Christian perfectionism. Once again, it could be argued that many respondents answering the question about keeping the health message ensuring salvation may have been answering within this framework. We tried to avoid this by using the word ensure and to not introduce other concepts that might imply that the health message would assist in salvation. So basically what they're trying to say here is that they wanted people to answer specifically the question, does the health message ensure salvation, not whether or not it assists. But this is very important because while many in North America, of which only 4.3% surveyed answered it ensures salvation, I would argue that there's a large part of the Adventist population in North America that would say it definitely assists in salvation. And this comes from my personal experiences with different church members. I have a friend, a pastoral friend, Ethan Muse, who he was a history major along with me at Southwestern. He has preached in many churches in Arizona, and now he's in the Midwest in Kansas and Oklahoma. And at some of these smaller churches, he got in fights with his own congregation because of the way he ate. And it became very clear during those conversations that these particular church members either believed that the health message, i.e. diet and abstinence from certain foods and drink, either guaranteed salvation or at least affected your chances of being saved. And so when I was kind of dwelling on this article, which again shook up a lot of people, a lot of debate, a lot of argument, I was kind of thinking, well, the problem with this paper is if you read the entire document, which isn't too long, and it is open source, so you can read it for yourself if you want, nowhere in there does McBride or any of the other authors mention the name of Kellogg. And this has been a trend I have seen amongst Adventist theologians and also Adventist academics, whenever the health message is considered, Kellogg sometimes is put on the back burner in favor of putting Ellen White to the forefront of the health message as its originator and as its main proponent. However, if you talk to members of the medical community, I'm thinking of a few CEOs of our Advent health system, of Florida Hospital and St. Helena Hospital, and even Hughley Hospital, they will name John Harvey Kellogg as the originator of the health message and its main proponent. So there seems to be a disconnect in John Harvey's place within Adventist medical practices and traditions. So in all of this, I started thinking, okay, and because I had done my dissertation and my research on John Harvey Kellogg and his health reform practices and principles, I kind of already had in my mind, well, this makes perfect sense. The idea that health reform can somehow lead to salvation, this is nothing new, at least to me. This all made sense in my head, but to other people it was strange. How on earth did we arrive to the point where 80% of an Adventist group in whichever part of the world could believe that the health message ensures salvation? And how did we get to the point where 50%, almost 50% of a globally surveyed Adventist group believes that health reform ensures salvation? And so to do that, we need to look at John Harvey Kellogg historically and his impact on Adventist health reform principles. Now, I'm not at all blaming Dr. McBride here. He's a sociologist. His whole purpose is to look at data, gather data, and then put it out there and say, here's what we found. And sociologists will put that out there, but won't really say, here's the solution, or they will say, this is a problem we see, or this is the data that we have found. And they're not historians. They're not meant, their goal is not to try and find the origin of where this belief comes from. So I'm not trying to down them or anything. I'm just saying it might have helped to mention that Kellogg was, somewhere in health reform. But moving on, most of us are perhaps familiar with John Harvey Kellogg. Some of us maybe are not. John Harvey Kellogg, born in 1852, died in 1943 at the age of 91 years. John Harvey Kellogg is the main proponent of Seventh-day Adventist health message material and principles. He, of course, built the famous Battle Creek Sanitarium and Medical Missionary College, and this is a picture of it from around the 1890s before it burned. And from the Battle Creek Sanitarium and the Medical Missionary College, his theories on health reform and health principles disseminated throughout not only the United States, but also throughout the world. The medical missionaries from his college were sent out all over the world to Asia, Africa, South America, and they took with them the ideas that Kellogg espoused at the Battle Creek Sanitarium. Now, most of us are familiar with John Harvey Kellogg because of course, Kellogg's cornflakes. If you haven't ever heard of John Harvey Kellogg as a health reformer, you probably have heard of cornflakes. You probably grew up eating them. There's a famous song, "What's More American Than Cornflakes?" So this is really a part of American history and American cultural growth, especially in the breakfast food industry. So while the shift of focus turns towards Kellogg's health food inventions, such as the cornflakes, but also some of the food we have today, such as Big Frank's, New Meat. Well, New Meat's not made anymore, sad day. But all of the health foods that we think of, a lot of people trace that back to Kellogg, and that's about where study on Kellogg tends to stop, unless you are interested in Adventist history or Kellogg specifically. So in my dissertation, I focused on the intercultural transfer of health reform principles between Europe and America, the ideas, the practices of health reform, and with Kellogg as a conduit between the two of them. And I divided this up into topical chapters, Kellogg and vegetarianism, Kellogg and sex, Kellogg and light therapy, and Kellogg and eugenics. Now, when I started going through all of the documents, which there are thousands upon, there's about 56,000 documents in the Kellogg archive alone that he wrote and published and things like that, not to mention all of his published books and letters. When you start going through all of this, there tends to be an underlying theme underneath everything he's doing, and that was an underlying theme of religion. When I first started writing this when I first started putting together this project, I was not intending it to be about religion in any stretch of the imagination. This is about health reform principles. And the more I read Kellogg and the more I read about what he was trying to accomplish in his work, the more I said, religion plays a huge part in this, so much so that I had to bring two historians that specialized in religion onto my dissertation committee and write a first chapter that studied Kellogg's religious background and specifically his relationship with Ellen White, which is a very long and involved chapter because Kellogg's religious beliefs are incredibly convoluted when you start reading everything that he's writing. So this is kind of how all of this came together and how I started looking into all these areas of Kellogg. So today, just to kind of keep things brief, I'm going to try and trace how health reform principles underneath Kellogg went from being matters of becoming healthy and taking care of yourself to a mode of salvation, what I would call salvific health reform. And it can get very complicated because of the language used. It can be somewhat distressing to some people who have never maybe looked into some of the things that Kellogg wrote and some of the things that he wanted to implement in society through his health reforms. So, starting out, we need to look at where health reform started with the Adventists. Very briefly, in 1863 through 1864, Ellen White received a series of visions, which are termed the health visions, basically, and were used to, as Ronald L. Numbers said in his very controversial book, Prophetess of Health, at least it was controversial at the time, Ronald L. Numbers noted that in these health visions, Ellen White really didn't see anything new. Or this was not new light, in other words, because the idea of vegetarianism, clean air, clean water, all those movements had been, and the idea of health reform being part of religion had been, in fact, preached by Sylvester Graham and other health reformers in the 1790s going into the early 1800s. Now, it is noted that Ellen White, when she was asked about this by her contemporaries, said that she was unaware of Graham's work and didn't see how it really affected what she saw. And Numbers noted that that seems unlikely because Graham was preaching in the very churches of which Ellen White was a member of when she was a teenager going on up. So, regardless, Numbers notes that the health visions received in 63 and 64 really had the massive effect of reorientating the Adventist Church towards the health message as a major tenet of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So since these visions came in, the health message was seen as has been quoted many a time, the opening wedge. Some of you may recognize that term. The opening wedge to allow Seventh-day Adventism to be preached to the non-believer. Moving on from that, the relationship between Ellen White, James White, and John Harvey Kellogg also has to be considered. So John Harvey Kellogg at the age of 12 was, for lack of a better term, adopted by the Whites. At the age of 12, he was living with his parents. In later letters, he will note that his father, he did suffer from certain forms of abuse from his father. He doesn't necessarily say that it was physical abuse, but it was certainly emotional and mental abuse from his father. He noted that while he escaped, his brother W.K. suffered more at the hands of his father. Later on, there are also letters to John Harvey from Ellen White where she notes that we knew we had to remove you from the darkness of your household. So essentially, as it would appear, Ellen and James White, who knew John Harvey's parents when they went to go visit them in the house, Ellen White sensed there's something wrong going on in this house. There's some form of darkness that is upon it. And she, at that time, recognized, as she would say, the brilliance of John Harvey, his aptitude towards being a good student, and later on would tell James, and James would tell John Harvey this. She saw in a vision that John Harvey was to be the leader of this new health reform movement that was being built up within the church. So at the age of 12, John Harvey was taken into the Whites' home, and from the age of 12 all the way until he went to medical school, he lived with the Whites. The Whites made sure he got jobs in a broom factory. Eventually, he was going to be the typesetter for James White at the Review and Herald Publishing Building. And it is during these formative years that Kellogg developed a mother-son relationship with Ellen White. And we don't have time to get into it. That's an entirely different subject. But essentially, John Harvey saw Ellen White more as his mother than his own biological mother. And this is very clear from the letters in between the two of them. And that relationship will not only anchor him to the Adventist denomination, but later on when that relationship gets frayed, it will serve to sever his relationship spiritually with the denomination as well. So, while John Harvey is the typesetter for Battle Creek, Michigan, he is reading every article that comes through the Review and Herald. He's reading every article that's being published and every book that's being published at the Review and Herald. He was a vivacious reader. And one of the articles that came through in 1866, by the way, I should mention that the Whites supported Kellogg in every way, including paying for his medical school, which in 1875 cost them $1,000, which was a lot of money for those two in 1875. So, moving forward, in 1866, around the same time that Kellogg is the typesetter for the Review and Herald, James having seen that he's really good at setting up the typing for the machines to print the different articles and books. This article by J.H. Wagner, the father of E.J. Wagner? The father of E.J. Wagner, comes across the Review and Herald. Now this is interesting because while Kellogg furthers the idea of health reform as a salvation issue, it doesn't originally start with him. It starts really with this article by J.H. Wagner in 1866, in which he writes about the health message. As mere physiological and hygienic truths, they might be studied by some at their leisure, and by others laid aside as of little consequence. But when placed on a level with the great truths of the third angel's message, by the sanction and authority of God's Spirit, and so declared to be the means whereby a weak people may be made strong to overcome, and our diseased bodies cleansed and fitted for translation, then it comes to us as an essential part of present truth to be received with the blessing of God or rejected at our peril. So this is really the beginning of where we see this idea of the health message being brought up to the same level as the three angels' message, the same level as the present truth, and given the authority of the Spirit of God. All these ideas are starting up. Kellogg's reading them, and this makes an impression upon his mind, so that by the time he becomes a doctor and begins serving at the Western Health Reform Institute, which will become the Battle Creek Sanitarium, this idea of being fit for translation via the health message is already there in his brain. So much so that two other articles that are going to come out later in his life in the 1890s are going to basically repeat the same things that Wagner started in 1866. In September 1898, Kellogg wrote, "We trample upon the laws of God, which relate to eating, to exercise, to dress, and to other matters of daily behavior toward our bodies. We have wandered so far away from God that we are conscienceless respecting these deviations from the path of physical rectitude. The important point is the fact that we have fallen, that we are down, and that we are sinking deeper and deeper into the quagmire of disease and physical unrighteousness." A few months before that, he's going to write, "If the church is to rescue the world, it must give the gospel trumpet another and different tone. It must teach physical righteousness as well as moral rectitude. It must teach the gospel of diet. We must recognize as a solemn reality that religion includes the body, and that the laws which govern the healthful performance of the bodily functions are as much the laws of God as those of the Decalogue." In these writings, Kellogg is equating, very obviously, the laws of health reform to the Ten Commandments. The Decalogue, of course, is the Ten Commandments. And it should be noted that good health is a widely disseminated a widely disseminated journal amongst not just Adventists, but also those among the secular medical community and other denominational medical works, the Baptists, the Catholics, the Evangelicals, the evangelical community. They're all reading Good Health. Good Health was one of the largest circulated medical journals in America, second only to probably The Lancet, which was the official scientific medical journal later on. So as if this isn't enough, Kellogg later on is going to write a letter to Ellen White where he basically spells out the continuation of these beliefs. And you can see how he starts mixing health principles and theology more and more in his articles. But he is going to be very specific with Ellen White when he writes in a letter to her, again in that same year actually that he published these two articles. He wrote to Ellen White, let's see here, "Those who meet the Lord when he comes will be above the power of disease as well as above the power of sin. They will reach this condition by obedience to the truth. The healing of disease is simply the completion of the work of forgiveness. It seems to me very clear that the sealing time cannot be very far in the future, and that the sealing of God is a physical and moral change which takes place in the man as the result of truth, i.e. health reform, and which shows in his very countenance that it is the seal of God. It seems to me our people have been wrong in regarding Sunday observance as the sole mark of the beast. When the individual yields to God complete obedience, every function of the body will be a faculty of the divine mind. It is the life of God that rules everything in the body of the righteous man, and if the will is completely surrendered to God, the power of God, which is in the man, must restore all the faculties and functions to their divine perfection. The greater gospel, which includes healing for the body and mind as well as for the soul through obedience, our people do not seem to appreciate. We are doing all we can to get this truth before the people." So in these very few quotes from not only the journals he wrote, but also his letters to Ellen White, you can see how Kellogg slowly developed this theology into not only is health reform a way of perfecting the body and becoming one with divinity, it's also, as he put it, the mark of the beast, or whether or not you receive the mark of the beast is based on health reform, which was new to me when I read this letter. I had never seen this letter before, and it has never been brought up. And so you can see how already in Kellogg's mind, salvation is a health reform issue. A health reform is a salvation issue. And this movement of salvific health reform is not only being taught in his writings, but also in his speeches. So I've only given you a selection of his writings and letters, but he's giving countless lectures and speeches in which he is saying these same things and proponing these same ideas. And his writings and his beliefs are being used to teach to the future medical missionaries in his college, which is also being spread out throughout the world. So you can see how this is an international movement where these ideas are beginning to get taught within local Adventist churches within the United States, but also in Adventist churches and congregations throughout the world. So, this obviously is going to eventually put him in conflict with Adventist leaders. Interestingly enough, these documents, these writings, these articles never earn him a reprimand with Adventist authorities, whether that be conference officials or even Ellen White. Ellen White, in her responses to these letters, either ignores what he's saying or has no specific reprimand for what he's saying. In fact, to this letter in particular, Ellen White never corrected him as far as his assumption that health reform was the mark of the beast, or that we were perhaps wrong that Sunday worship was the mark of the beast, and that rejection of health reform is also part of that mark. She never corrected him on this issue. Of course, this was while she was down in Australia, so things may have been a little stressful for her down there, but there was never a letter telling Kellogg, hey, you're not going down the right path here, you're not thinking correctly. Self-correct, right? So, spiritual break, 1899. As I stated before, Kellogg saw Ellen White as his mother, but she was also his spiritual guru. She was also his confessor, basically. And the reason I came to that conclusion was anytime Kellogg had issues concerning his depression or sometimes his manic episodes, he would write to Ellen White about what he was experiencing. And whenever he would write to Ellen White of these personal issues, it was always handwritten letters. because if they were typed letters, that meant that they went through his stenographers and his secretaries, and he didn't want anyone knowing what he was writing to her. Also, we know that there were countless personal meetings between the two of them. She was over at his house all the time. In the famous 1901 General Conference session, she stayed, when she got back from Australia, she stayed in his house during the entirety of that conference. We have no idea what was spoken between them. I would pay infinite amounts of money to have been a fly on that wall. And we don't know if she counseled him against some of the things he was believing. There's no, like I said, there's no record, so we can only go off of the letters between him and her and his various articles and statements. So in 1899, the spiritual break. What do I mean by this? In 1899, because of a breakdown of communication between Ellen White and John Harvey, and the fact that a few people were accusing John Harvey of breaking health reform principles, such as using prescription drugs at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, prescription drugs in this case meaning cocaine and opium, Ellen White wrote a letter to Kellogg condemning him for doing these things. Kellogg's response was, "I thought, given our relationship, you would give me the benefit of the doubt." And he said, I feel like I can no longer trust you, and I feel like you no longer have confidence in me as you once did. She wrote a letter apologizing for accusing him in such a way, and said she had no idea that it would affect him like that, and wanted to try and reconcile the relationship. The only problem is that she's still in Australia at this point. It takes 3 months to get letters that were written from Michigan to Australia and vice versa. By the time her letter for reconciliation reaches Battle Creek, Kellogg has already left for Europe. And on that trip to Europe, he writes another letter to her on the stationery of the steamliner taking him to Paris, saying, "I feel that I can't trust you anymore, that you don't trust me." And it's very clear that he's breaking their relationship, because he never again, after this series of letters in 1899, writes to her in the personal tones and confessing to her as he once did. He goes to Europe. The letters she wrote him doesn't reach him for about a year, because while he was only supposed to be in Europe for about a week at a conference in Paris, he disappeared completely. Nobody knew where he was, and he pops up again about a year later, almost about 7 or 8 months later. He reappears in Vienna, Austria, and writes a letter to Ellen White saying, "I feel refreshed. I felt that I have reconnected with the Lord." He went down, come to find out, through North Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, went through all of those areas, went up through the Holy Land, took a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, as he described it, so that he could become closer to God. Then he went back through Turkey, where he claims that he administered health reform principles, but also medical aid to the harem of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And then found his way back into Vienna, Austria, where he wrote this letter to Ellen White saying, "I feel that I have a new purpose in our health reform mission, and I feel with God's help we're going to continue forward." He never again mentions the letters he wrote in 1899, and he's never again going to bring it up. And Ellen White's not going to bring it up. And again, personally, I think it probably happened when they met at his house in 1901, but we don't know. So after this spiritual break in 1899, remember, Ellen White is the one that keeps Kellogg grounded in Adventist principles and Adventist theology. Any issue he has on theology, he goes to her, and she typically will ask him medical questions so that he can administer health reform principles, not only to her because of her various illnesses, but also to people around her, especially in Australia, who were suffering from different medical ailments. Once he breaks that relationship with her, spiritually speaking, he's in the wind. He's desperately searching for anything that can fill this void in his heart. And this spiritual break seems simple, but it's actually very traumatic for Kellogg. I mentioned he suffered from depression and manic episodes. I took his works and writings to a local doctor of psychology here in Keene, and he diagnosed him with cyclothymic disorder, meaning that Kellogg tended to go through cycles of depression and hypomania very frequently. In fact, you can see it in his letters. On one page of his letters, he's talking about how God is giving him the energy to sleep only an hour a day and then work the rest of 23 hours without fail. And then not 3 or 4 paragraphs later, Kellogg's wishing for death. And so he goes through these cycles in his own letters. And so Ellen White is really the only thing that's keeping him from having not just a spiritual break, but a mental break within his own mind. And once this happens, this trauma affects him to the point where he has to find something to fill this understanding of God. Because up until this point, his understanding of God was mitigated via Ellen White. She was the one that gave him counsel and helped him in his struggles with his own beliefs in God. And once that's gone, he has to try and fill this void. And so I started looking into this. And this actually started when I was looking into the whole pantheism controversy thing. And the more I read his stuff, the more I found that his statements didn't necessarily line up with what we would today describe as pantheism, or rather the belief that there is no person God in heaven, that God is all matter and all matter is divine, which is the technical term of pantheism. And Kellogg didn't seem to ascribe to that. He never, in fact, in that book right down there on the stage, the first edition of the Living Temple, he noted that, no, there is a person of God ruling in heaven. And so it kind of seemed strange to me. And is this pantheism, is it not? Pantheism, and is it not? And so I started reading and digging deeper and digging deeper. And I found a GC bulletin from, 1901, that very famous GC meeting, where Kellogg talks about in this speech in the GC having met with a local bishop, in this case the bishop, as far as I can find, the Bishop of Kalamazoo, Henry Joseph Richter, who was visiting one of his parishioners in the hospital, and Kellogg happened to run into him in the hallway, and they decided to have a sit down and discuss their various beliefs as concerns health reform. But another interesting item popped up. So Kellogg was telling this to the people during one of his lectures, and he noted that in this conversation, the Catholic bishop said, "God is the head of everything. He is the head of you, and he is the head of me. When I reach out my arm, and draw it in, there is a creation. God is creating in my arm the power with which I use my arm." "Do you really believe that?" I asked. "Why, that is exactly what I believe," he answered. "Of course I believe it. It is certainly the truth." "Well," I said, "I believe that too. God is in me, and everything I do is God's power. Every single act is a creative act of God. This Catholic bishop was talking the same lesson I am trying to talk to you tonight." So this, of course, sent off fireworks in my head. And I said, okay, this is something that I have to get further into. And I jumped down a massive rabbit hole. So essentially, the same ideas that Kellogg is putting in that book, The Living Temple, for which he's accused of being a pantheist in, are the same ideas that this bishop is talking to him about and giving him examples of 2 years before that book is published. So I said, okay, so where's the bishop getting these ideas from? If you go into Catholic history, at this time in the Catholic Church, Pope Leo XIII was in charge of the Vatican and the Holy See. Now, Pope Leo XIII is a very unique pope among Vatican history, in that he is one of the first popes that attempts to modernize the Catholic Church. He is going to try and bring Catholicism back to a homogeneous religion. So at this point, because of the fact that Victor Emmanuel overthrew the Catholic Church and its official secular authority in the 1860s and put the Pope under house arrest up until Mussolini reinstates him in 1929, up until this point, the Catholic world is pretty fractured. Different sects of Catholicism are believing certain things, and Pope Leo wants to try and bring everybody back onto the same page. And one of the first things he's going to do, actually, is going to make it a theological precedent that the veneration of the Virgin Mary must be believed in order to be Catholic. Up until this point, there were various parts of the Catholic Church that didn't believe in the veneration of Mary. To this day, I know of a few Catholic friends who don't believe in the veneration of Mary. But Leo, at least, is going to make this a tenet of the Catholic Church. On top of that, he's also going to say, up until this point, theology has been kind of scattered between the teachings of St. Augustine, St. Ambrose, and a lot of the other church fathers. We are going to now bring Catholic theology underneath the definition of one singular theologian in the church, and that is St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived in the 13th century. Now, Thomas Aquinas, why does any of this matter? Because if you read Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, this massive 1,000-something page work that he wrote, meaning all theology, he talks about the nature of God and man. And more specifically, he uses the exact same example, reaching out the arm and bringing it back in, that the Catholic bishop did to Kellogg in 1901. So essentially, once I started digging more and more, the link was starting to make sense. And whether Kellogg realized it or not, he was participating in a new Catholic theology that was just coming to the forefront of the world that was meant to bring God into a closer relationship with humanity, at least in our understanding of God. So Thomas Aquinas' theory laid out, and this is from the 24 Fundamental Theses of Official Catholic Philosophy: the agent, a human, depends on God for its existence, for its powers, for the conservation that existence and of these powers. It depends also on God for the very exercise of these powers, because, this is theological rhetoric here, because in exercising these powers, the agent passes from potency to act. Its faculties do not move except insofar as they are moved. There must be a motion coming from the immovable mover, God. So to put this in terms that Kellogg is going to use later on in the book The Living Temple, God is the explanation of nature, not a God outside of nature, but in nature, manifesting himself through and in all the objects, movements, and varied phenomena of the universe. The process of tree making in the living tree is never complete so long as the tree is alive. The tree does not create itself. A creative power is constantly going forward in it. So there is present in the tree a power which creates and maintains it, a tree maker in the tree, a flower maker in the flower, a divine architect who understands every law of proportion, an infinite artist who possesses a limitless power of expression in color and form. There is, in all the world around us, an infinite, divine, though invisible presence, to which the unenlightened may be blind, but which is ever declaring itself by its ceaseless, beneficent activity. So essentially, Kellogg, in his own words, is trying to espouse this new theology that he has come to understand in his own personal life, and wants to, most times, if anybody's ever had a conversion moment, when you experience a new idea that you believe is truth, what's the first thing you want to do? You want to go tell everybody about it. Kellogg has found this new idea. And to kind of disseminate what Aquinas is saying, and I would hesitate to venture that most theologians here and otherwhere and in our church would have no problem with us making the statement that all life on this earth and even in the universe depends on God to sustain it. And that if you are cut off from that source of power from God Almighty, you cease to exist. We would term it perhaps as the second death. So this is theologically not something we would argue with today, but here Kellogg is trying to take a theological idea and put it into health reform and scientific terms. And when you start mixing language like that, it gets confusing, it gets hard to understand what Kellogg is saying, and eventually he's accused of pantheism. It also might be noted that Thomas Aquinas was also accused of pantheism when he first wrote that in the 13th century. But nobody is saying, Kellogg is not saying that the tree is God, or that God is physically in that tree, but rather that the power of God is in that tree, sustaining its ability to live and grow. In much the same way as a part of the power of God must exist, we would maybe term this as the breath of life, in humanity to sustain its ability to live, but also, remember the arm. Aquinas goes a little further and says that in order for you to move that arm, God has to will you to move that arm. Theologically, you can differ on this, but this is what Kellogg is espousing in the Living Temple and in his health reform movements. Now, he is going to take this further, and there are two. I should probably go over this first, though. As far as his connections with the Vatican and the Holy See, I dug and found out that Kellogg actually did have a relationship with Dr. Giuseppe Laponi, who is the chief papal physician of the Holy See. He's also the private physician of the Pope. And upon digging further, we find that Kellogg's works, including the Living Temple, are in the Vatican Library and also the Vatican Secret Archives, which I was told that even though there are no letters in their registry from Kellogg to the Pope, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. As I was told by the head of the archives, we have 53 miles of shelving underneath Vatican City, and we have only cataloged 10% of the collection of the Vatican Secret Archives. And they've been archiving it for 100 years so far. So at that rate, it'll be 1,000 years before they get it all cataloged. But essentially, he said, the letters between a doctor from America to His Holiness is probably not going to take the same precedence as the letters from, say, a emperor or a king to the Pope. So could possibly be there is what I was told. They said check back in about 100 years. So I said, okay, fair enough. But the connections are still there. Giuseppe Laponi, through the records in the archives, made several visits to the United States. And again, when Kellogg went on these journeys in Europe, he didn't always note where he ended up. But we know that he made several different journeys to Italy, and we know that he toured the Vatican itself. So at different points, his connections with Giuseppe Laponi became apparent, and he even sent Giuseppe Laponi a copy of his book, The Living Temple, for review before it was to be published. And it is one of the surviving copies because most of the copies of that book were burned when the Review and Herald burned to the ground in 1902, and also because it was later on condemned as containing the heresy of pantheism, a lot of the copies of that book were destroyed. There are only about 15 that we know of in archives, and a lot are in private hands, such as Michael Campbell's private collection down here that he has, and I have one in my collection in a fire safe at home. So they're very hard to come by, which is why it astounded me when it was listed in the Vatican Library. So Kellogg continues this idea of health reform being a mode of salvation in 2 or 3 of the areas that I looked into. Now, if you look into, say, hydrotherapy and some of the other areas that he developed in health reform, you will see rhetoric that leans towards this is a religious matter, healing water. Kellogg continually is going to blend theological rhetoric with his scientific and medical rhetoric. Healing water from God, life-giving water. Christ said, I am the water of life. He's going to mix those words in with hydrotherapy, scientific hydrotherapy, and the reforms that he implements at Battle Creek Sanitarium. But there were 3 major areas where I found that this theology of the connection of God being in man kind of blossomed. So the theory here is that if God is in man and that in the idea that God's power resides within humanity, then humanity can do things that either restrict the flow of that power from God or allow for its full fruition into being physically fit for translation to heaven and also living a sinless life. And so some of these things are going to come into play. If you read in, for instance, Life, Its Mysteries and Miracles, of which there's actually a copy, isn't there? Oh, you actually have it in your hand. If you go to that book, you will see 2 quotes here where Kellogg is talking about food, in particular pure food. And pure food, as he would define it, would be the food as he prescribed, which would be a vegetarian diet, avoiding meat, avoiding tobacco and alcohol. And these things are going to be kind of mixed in with these passages. So as he states in this book, as we have elsewhere said, pure food is light stored, done up in bundles, convenient to enter into the service of the temple, the vehicle by means of God's own life and energy become a part of the living body. But the eating must be done in harmony with the divine order. We see then that in one sense the filling of the body with light, illuminating it, so to speak, may be accomplished by eating pure food, and that if we would have no part of dark, we must be careful to introduce into it nothing by which darkness will be communicated to it. Light is life, darkness is death. A body full of light is a body full of life, activity, and energy. A dark body is dead or dying. It is evident that the words of the Christ have a profound spiritual meaning, but it is equally evident that, like other great fundamental truths, their application is as exact and apt in relation to physical as in relation to spiritual things. You can see the continuation of what he wrote in the Gospel of Health there. He continues on, by eating pure food, the wall of partition between the natural and the spiritual is broken down, and all things become changed. Not that the spiritual is brought down, but that the natural and the physical are lifted up, spiritualized, transfigured. And if these kind of sound familiar, this is very close to the Catholic doctrine of the Eucharist, that by eating God, physically eating God, the belief of the transubstantiation, you are partaking the holiness of God into you, and your body is transformed, transfigured, and you are made fit for salvation. Now, this is written after Kellogg's spiritual break. This is written after the publication of the Living Temple. This is written actually in 1910. And you can see how these theories of what you eat affecting your body and making it fit for salvation, and the ideas of health reform as a mode of salvation, are starting to really get solidified in Kellogg's teaching. Sorry, every time I step on that floor, it creaks. They didn't fix that when they redid the stage. So this is what we find in just a small glimpse of what Kellogg got up to in terms of vegetarianism, where he begins mimicking this idea of God is in the food you are eating, and by partaking of that pure food, you are bringing God into your body. This to me it may seem strange to y'all, but this to me makes perfect sense when you think about how he's already kind of branching out into Aquinas theory here. And of course, he's never going to state that he's dabbling in Aquinas theory or that he learned from the Catholics what he was espousing, but he does admit that he had a conversation with that bishop in 1901, and we do know the connections that he has with the papal physician and the meetings between them. So besides eating God and the idea of food in salvation and health reform, we also have a secondary conception of salvific health reform, which is the light of God. Now, this one is perhaps more rhetorical than anything, meaning having to do with Kellogg's language. But essentially, in his writings, Kellogg is going to state that the sunlight, the rays of the sun coming down, are like the arms of God reaching down to place healing on those who are sick. Now, light therapy is a very interesting topic in which Kellogg is going to introduce various, I love that picture, it's always shocking, in which Kellogg is going to introduce various themes of light therapy solutions, in particular heliotherapy, sunbathing, which you can see Kellogg participating in there, but also scientific uses of ultraviolet light and ultraviolet light irradiation on things such as tumors. In this case, the healing of skin tuberculosis, which is a very, very horrifying disease that was predominantly in Europe at this time and affected children. It ate away at the skin, much like leprosy does, and it's incredibly painful. And Kellogg would actually hire some of the physicians who were using ultraviolet irradiation to cure these things to come and set up light therapy clinics, not only in Battle Creek Sanitarium, but also in the Skodsberg Sanitarium in Denmark. In particular, he was friends with Niels Svensson and Auguste Royer, who wrote the book that you can see here. So while Auguste Royer and Niels Svensson did not use religious language in their works and in their books, they would note at the very beginning that the earliest of sun cults, particularly in Egypt, believed that the sun, being the sun god Re, was able to stretch out its healing hands and heal people. In fact, in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it specifically states that the sun god Re reaches forth via the light from the sky and heals the bodies of the sick, which later on in his own writings, Kellogg will mirror that idea, except it's God's hands coming down. So this idea of the sun being a method of healing is ancient in its inception, and Kellogg is going to write that God can heal both physically and spiritually by touching humanity through sunlight. So I don't want to do specific quotes on him because we're running out of time, but this is another mode where we see this idea of that sunlight is the Spirit of God coming down and interacting with humanity. Now, this is where I kind of wanted to get to, and that is eugenics. Usually when I say the word eugenics, about 50% of the audience that I'm speaking to knows what I'm talking about. And the other half sometimes doesn't. So just to be clear, the eugenic movement developed in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. The eugenic movement was the belief that humanity could, either through various institutions of selective breeding or sterilization or even euthanasia, could breed a better human race. And this was an outgrowth of Francis Galton, who was the cousin of Charles Darwin, the belief that humanity was just like a pedigree chart, that just like you can breed certain animals with certain desirable traits, which is how you get different toy shepherds and things like that, you can do the same thing with humanity, except that the eugenics movement takes it a step further and says we can breed out things like tendencies to violence, tendencies to alcoholism, tendencies to poverty. It was believed that things like poverty and violence were genetic traits that could be passed down through children rather than environmental situations. For Kellogg, the eugenic movement is kind of the culmination of everything he's been working towards. This idea of bringing not only all the health reform principles that he's implemented, so light therapy, vegetarianism, ideas about sex and everything else, kind of all comes underneath the umbrella of the eugenic movement. And so his idea here is he wants to bring the eugenic movement into a religious understanding. He's friends with most of the progenitors of the eugenic movement, including Charles Davenport, Henry Ford, and a lot of the other Fishers in there as well. He's friends with all of these big names within the eugenic movement, and he desperately tries to get them to bring the eugenic movement into what I call theistic eugenics. So Kellogg, for the most part, rejected the ideas of sterilization and euthanasia because he says these aren't really going to work. He really wanted to implement a government-supervised medical program nationwide that would essentially make sure that people who have good medical traits would not marry people with poor medical traits. So if you had somebody who had no history in their family of heart conditions, you wouldn't want them to marry somebody who had a heart condition in their family history. So those two people shouldn't be allowed to marry, as far as he was concerned. Because of his involvement with the eugenics movement and his creation of the Race Betterment Foundation Society, of which he hosted conferences of at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, he has been accused by modern historians of being a racist because they say you can't believe in eugenics and not be a racist. That would be Howard Markle. I disagree with him on that point, but that's a different topic entirely. But essentially, the eugenic movement, as far as Kellogg is concerned, becomes the foray into this salvific health reform. Pardon me, I have to find the quote. There we go. So in his address to the Race Betterment Conference, Kellogg says that if citizens will follow the precepts of biological law, which is what he used in terms of his health principles and health reform movements, then a new species of man may be created in not more than 6 generations. And within about a century, Kellogg envisioned that the buildup of these new people would bring about a golden age in which hospitals and prisons will no longer be needed, and natural health will have been restored as the crowning result of human achievement and obedience to biologic law. Later on in his life, Kellogg is going to write several different articles concerning eugenics and the idea of restoring the divine image within man, which, as you can see, is nothing but a progression of the theology he's been developing in his own health reform movements. But one of the last articles he's going to write in his lifetime, he says, quote, "The greater gospel, which defines sin as the transgression of any law, which relates to man's well-being, gives sin a broader meaning than the simple transgression of the so-called moral law. If the church is to rescue the world, it must give the gospel trumpet another and a different tone. It must teach physical righteousness as well as moral rectitude. It must teach a gospel of diet, of baths, of exercise, of cleanliness, of domestic sanitation. It must recognize Christ in man as well as Christ on the cross. Our race deterioration cannot cease until we recognize as a solemn reality that, that religion includes the body, and that the laws which govern the healthful performance of the bodily functions are as much the laws of God as those of the Decalogue. Sound familiar? He's reusing the same rhetoric he's been using and developing from the late 1800s, and now he's influencing this into the Eugenics movement. Towards the end of his life in the 1930s, Kellogg withdraws himself away from his Battle Creek Sanitarium and his health reform movements. He's getting older. He's getting on up into his upper 80s. And the Great Depression is not kind to Kellogg, and the Battle Creek Sanitarium goes into receivership. He himself is going to go down to the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Miami, Florida, where he writes in the 1930s, and this is actually one of the few things that he writes towards the end of his life, and he never published this, it's just in the notes in the archives. He wrote that the great creative intelligence, him that made the universe and keeps it in order and created man, working through eugenics and the marvelous germplasm, may save the race and even improve it. He continued to say that there was surely enough left in man of the qualities planted in him by his Maker to make his salvation possible. Kellogg, in other areas also, is going to state that eugenics was a gift given to humanity to save the human race by God. And I was reading through the dissertation early this morning to try and find that quote, and I know it's in there. It's a long chapter, and I couldn't find it for the life of me. So, for most of you, you're probably thinking, I've never heard of this before. It's never been written in an Adventist textbook. Where on earth does this come from, and how on earth did we miss all of this? Well, after his death, the church is going to go on what I would call, for lack of a better word, a smearing campaign to discredit Kellogg and a lot of his work, which is why I think there's a disconnect where theologians will say Ellen White is the founder of the health message, and the medical workers will say it's Kellogg. But essentially, in this book, The Story of Our Health Message, which was published, and it's a very early edition in the 1940s, right after Kellogg died. In fact, I think it was published a few months after his death. And then the second edition came out in the 1960s. Kellogg is mentioned only twice in this history of the Adventist health message. As it continues on, Kellogg was kind of said, well, after his disfellowshipment from the church, his influence in the church kind of died out, which is relatively incorrect. Kellogg is still going to have an influence on medical workers. He's the Adventist Health. Advent Health is, well, what is today Advent Health, but the Adventist hospitals are still going to send their employees to train at his Battle Creek Sanitarium. His influence from the church never actually wanes as far as the health movement is concerned. But today, not 70 years after his death, we still have issues of reconciling what he means to Adventist history. And in most cases, and unfortunately since that time period, Kellogg has been a subject of lambasting in popular culture, such as T. Carangus Boyle's novel, The Road to Wellville, which is made into a movie, starring Anthony Hopkins as Kellogg. He does a good job. But this is how our society remembers Kellogg for the most part, that and the cornflakes. And the real history of what Kellogg got up to in his health reform practices and the health reform movement gets hidden under a lot of church history, no offense intended. And so the official story, at least as it was taught to me and others at the time, is that Kellogg was a pantheist who was disfellowshipped from the church, and there it ends, really. And we never dug any further into that. As, well, what was Kellogg doing? What were the underlying themes in his health reform practices and movements? So, while Kellogg faded from mainstream Adventism as the leader and founder of the health reform message within the Seventh-day Adventist denomination, his beliefs on health reform and its implications for salvation continued on through the nearly 70 years of influence with the denomination via the health workers and laypersons who were inculcated in his beliefs. On top of this, it should also not be forgotten that the medical workers within the Adventist Church recognized, and in many cases continue to recognize, Kellogg as the authoritative originator of Seventh-day Adventist medical work. Thus, it is not surprising that many of Kellogg's hitherto unknown theories about the role of health reform in salvation have continued to affect Seventh-day Adventists less than a century after his death. So, in order to understand how to address this now theological issue, which despite the continual preaching and articles from church leadership persists in our denomination, we as Adventists really need to reconcile the true legacy of Kellogg and continue a dialogue on the role of health reform in salvation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Lunyon, and we'll have an opportunity here in just a few minutes for you to ask some questions, some dialogue. But first, we have a tangible way that to be able to support this lecture series and future lectures. I've asked Professor Bowser, who's going to tell you about a tangible way that you can do that. And then after that, I'll tell you about some upcoming lectures that will be coming up around the corner. I've asked Chris, and then Alan, can I borrow you for just a minute? Will you help us out? I know I'm putting you on the spot to help collect. Yeah, you look like a good deacon today. Yeah, it wouldn't be a good Adventist meeting without an offering, right? So, Professor Bowser.
These events are free because of the support of ordinary people who make contributions to Adventist Theological Society. Our expenses are low. People like Dr. Lunyon, who live nearby, he could have walked here from his house. But we bring in people from farther away, and there are expenses associated with that, although they are lower than they could be because we're careful. So if you would like to help by contributing to our budget, you can do so very easily. We are passing around some offering plates, and some of you may recognize them if you ever attended classes or assembly in Evans Hall. They actually were salvaged from there. So these are historic artifacts. Yes, so if that inspires you to put a little extra in the plate, that would be welcome. Thank you.
Thank you again.
American.
Thank you in advance for your willingness to help support the Amethyst Theological Society. I'll tell you about a couple of upcoming events that are going to be happening. October 2, the Hal Wright Lecture Series will have its first lecture of the school year. Todd Bolsinger will be speaking. He's the author of the book Canoeing the Mountains. That was a favorite book on campus for one of our faculty book clubs, and so we're just really honored that he'll be coming here to speak. I believe that one will be at the University Church, at the Keene Church, so that will be on October 2nd. Then on October 23, we have Kristen Dumay, who is the author of Jesus and John Wayne, and that's made possible in partnership with ATS as well as with the University Library and a number of other people that have helped to make that possible. So again, we've got two major authors that will be coming on our campus to speak. I'm delighted. I know Dr. Dumay is on the New York Times bestseller list, so that's pretty exciting to have someone of that caliber coming and interacting with people on our campus. And then last but not least, on December 4th, we kind of rearranged our schedule just a little bit. We were hoping to have Judd Lake, but because of COVID and travel restrictions, but he will be coming to speak as part of the Adventist Theological Society lecture series on December 4th. And again, funds that you contribute help to make events like that possible. So thank you very much. We'll have a moment here. I do want to, I know Dr. Lunyon mentioned the Living Temple as well as some other Kellogg books, and I'm enough of an Adventist historian that I love show and tell. So I ran over to my office to grab some of my original copies, and it's probably one of only 2 places in the world, I believe, where you can find, where you can actually see in one location all 4 different editions of the Living Temple. So these books that he was telling you about in the lecture. So if you'd like to see those after we're done, I'll have those up here. And then, of course, after the Q&A, we'll have an opportunity for our local chapter. So if you'd like to be involved, just stay by after the Q&A. And I might just add, since I'm a collector, this copy of Life that he quoted, it's actually autographed by John Harvey Kellogg. So you can have a look at that once we're done. So without any further ado, my colleague Tony here, if you'd grab the other microphone, he'll kind of wander around and would love to have some of your questions here this afternoon so we have an opportunity to dialogue with our presenter.
This one.
Should be on. Just speak nice and loud, Dr. Madiri.
All right.
Yeah.
Hi. I am originally from Zimbabwe, which falls. Okay, I don't know. It's not working.
Yeah, just nice, as loud as you can. I'm sorry, our sound person had to step out. Is that one working?
Testing. No. All right, I think I'll just speak.
Go ahead.
I'm originally from Zimbabwe, which falls under the Southern Africa Indian Ocean Division. So just citing the article you mentioned earlier, say Christian Today. As far as I know, most Adventists in Zimbabwe are not vegan. And I think I can speak relatively accurately for most of that region. So I found it interesting that the numbers you mentioned that I think you said it was some 80% or something, 59%
Yeah.
believed in. I think we hear more of health reform discussions over here than we have over there. So I was just wondering if you know like the sample size, because you're talking about percentage, which can be misleading depending on how representative were those numbers in terms of the region, the number of countries that were sampled, what was the sample size, and when was that article published? Because I found it just interesting.
Yeah. The article was basically kind of just what set me off into trying to answer the question of how health reform became a salvation issue within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But as far as what I have seen in that article, it was published back in March of this year. And I believe McBride and them sampled somewhere around just 63,000 Adventists. I'm not a sociologist, so I can't speak to how adequate a sampling that is. I would be very interested to see a change in question of, rather than asking, does health reform ensure salvation? I'd be very interested to see how many people answer strongly agree or agree on, does health reform affect salvation, right? And it would be very interesting to see how they answer those numbers. As far as how the sample size of the individual regions, I'd have to go back into the article and look that up for the moment. Actually, if you want, you can have my copy of it. In there they talk about, that's it. In there they talk about the sample sizes and the more specific numbers. I was using this article basically to give you an idea of why I was getting curious in the idea of how something like health reform can become a salvation issue. But as far as I know, the number that they surveyed was 63,000, which to me seems rather small for a church of, 18 million worldwide? And those are the conclusions they came to. Now, they did note in that article that a lot of these regions, while they don't adhere to veganism or vegetarianism simply because they don't have access to, say, health foods or things like that in regions of Africa, not always have access to meat substitutes or things like that, it didn't prevent them from answering, agree or strongly agree, that health reform ensured salvation, which I thought was a very interesting point in that article. So, but yeah, feel free to, that article maybe will answer some of your questions. Like I said, to me, I wasn't so much interested in proving, disproving, or really arguing with that article. That article is basically, and the Christianity Today article and all the buzz that it created, is what set me off in saying, okay, historically, how did this happen? How does the church and the members of that church come to a point where they're willing to accept that health reform can either affect your salvation or, in fact, ensures salvation, as the question they're asking there. So is that... I wish I had more answers, but I'm not the guy who wrote that article, and so like I said, that's what started this whole journey and paper that I'm writing. So, yeah. Lionel, good to see you.
My name is Lionel Stein. I'm a former bodybuilding champion from South Africa. I've come to the United States hoping that I can be a blessing to everybody and all those young people in the university. I looked at Kellogg's pictures. He does not look at all like any advert when it comes to health reform. And I'm very disappointed to see many of our folks do not follow the health reform message the way they should. Kellogg's is no example as far as I'm concerned looking at these pictures. Thank you very much.
Mm.
Kind of scandalized us with that one picture.
Sorry, it's a picture. So that's a picture buried deep in the archives, as you might imagine. And it's not in the Adventist archives either. It's in the University of Michigan. Essentially, just speaking to the body form of Kellogg, he was a very short man. He's actually shorter than my wife. He was 5'4". And the diet that people were being put on in that time period, in place of meat, was not only high in protein, but it was also very high in gluten. And gluten in high quantities tends to give you the nice pudginess, which I also suffer from. So I've been eating Big Franks for most of my life. And so that probably explains the way he looks further on. He wasn't, however, if you look at the people who followed his health reform principles, which I didn't, there's no time to include all these pictures. If you look at the people working out in his Battle Creek Sanitarium, yeah, they all look like bodybuilders. And so he himself perhaps did not practice entirely what he preached, but I would note that for someone born in 1852, he lived to be 91 years old. So, a pre-Civil War baby living that long is pretty spectacular. But yes, as you noted, he was flabby there towards the end, wearing the loincloth, which, by the way, he got the idea for in Europe when he was visiting Switzerland. Anyways.
Pastor Longan, could you talk a little bit about, you mentioned Ellen White and John Harvey Kellogg. It is phenomenal. At the beginning of the 20th century, the network that this man has. I was at the Adventist village there, and there's a picture on the wall of Harvey Firestone, Thomas Edison.
Of Firestone Tires?
Yeah, Harvey Firestone, Thomas Edison, and one other. How in the world, to have that kind of network and influence, to get those people to come to his sanitarium? Truly, this person was more worldwide known than Ellen White at this time. Mm-hmm. And can you just address that a little? I mean, I keep reading things. Johnny Weissmuller broke a world swimming record there while he was at the sand. To have those kind of connections are incredible. Mm-hmm. President of the United States was there.
Three different presidents were there.
3 different presidents. Mm-hmm. It's amazing. Yeah. Where's he making these connections?
Okay, so Kellogg, not only through his dissemination of the health reform message in popular journals and in publications. In fact, there's a book right here, Plain Facts, first published in 1877, went through several different editions. Now, if you wouldn't mind holding that up there, Michael. So you can see this is, thank you. This is a relatively small book, Plain Facts, this is actually Plain Facts about sexual life. This is going to be enlarged to a book about yay thick, close to 1,000 pages, called Plain Facts for Old and Young. It goes through like 11 different editions, I think, and it becomes the main manual, home manual for health and healthful living for all of the United States. The book is going to be found regularly in not just Adventist homes, but even non-Adventist homes. So everybody in the nation, the best way I can describe it is that Kellogg is his generation's Dr. Oz. Dr. Oz, most of you probably know, he has his own television show now. He got his start on the Oprah Winfrey Show, giving medical advice and things like that, and he becomes really this celebrity doctor. And Kellogg is much the same way. And he develops these connections because the health reform movement outside of the Adventist context, becomes part of the progressive movement, which of course is a political, cultural movement within the United States to alleviate a lot of the problems caused by the industrialization of the United States, the pollution, the darkness of industrialized America, bringing people into the light of progressivism. And health reform is seen as a major mode for doing that, increasing people's health, longevity, cleaner water, cleaner air, exposure to the sunlight, better food. The FDA Food and Drug Act is brought about by a novel from 1904 called The Jungle. Upton Sinclair wrote about the meat processing plants and how filthy it was, and the fact that sometimes humans fell into the fat boilers and they boiled human fat along with the animal fat and sent it out to be consumed. All of that is in the progressive era, and since Kellogg is one of the major proponents of health reform during this time period, he starts making those connections. He also is very big in Europe. So when he trained in Europe for about 2 years after he graduated from medical school here, because he felt the Europeans were far more advanced than the United States in health reform, which they were. He studied in Vienna underneath famous surgeons at the Imperial College there, and he brought back a lot of surgical techniques that were unheard of in America. For instance, he studied underneath the father of gynecology, William Lawson Tate, in England, and learned how to save a mother who was suffering from tubal pregnancy, where the fetus is implanted in the fallopian tube rather than the uterus. And of course, that is a death sentence for any mother in the 1890s. He learned how to do that surgery, brings it back to America, and performs at the Battle Creek Sanitarium. So now, anybody who has issues like that are all heading to the SAN. And people are praising that this new medical technology is available to them. Through these connections, he's going to make friends with, you mentioned Firestone and I believe Edison, but he also is friends with John D. Rockefeller, Carnegie, the big industrialists of the age, Henry Ford, who's a big mover in the Eugenics movement, also Leo Tolstoy. Leo Tolstoy was sick, and his daughter wrote to Kellogg to come and help him. Kellogg makes the journey all the way to Russia to go help Leo Tolstoy become better and healthier. And then while he's there, he meets with Pavlov of the famous Pavlov Institute and hires Pavlov's chief of staff to come back to Battle Creek with him to establish a Pavlov Institute at the Battle Creek Sanitarium. He also mixes in with royalty. The Kellogg light bath, where he used light bulbs, it becomes popular with the Kaiser Wilhelm and King Edward VII of England. Also, it spreads up into the Nordic with the Norwegian royal family, the Swedish royal family, the Danish royal family, actually patroned the Skodsberg Sanitarium there in Denmark, all of which is underneath the auspices of Kellogg's Battle Creek Sanitarium. So through these systems of sanitariums, which were built all over the world, including one in Japan, which was destroyed when we dropped a bomb on Hiroshima, because that's where the sanitarium was, and different places throughout Asia, and Mexico, down in Guadalajara. Kellogg's teachings and his name, because they're connected with those teachings, spreads throughout the world. So everybody knows who he is. He's a household name in the 1890s and into the early 1900s. But because he has all these connections with all these famous peoples, presidents, politicians, all members, at least within the United States progressive movement, his name gets written down and sent in letters to various other famous people saying, hey, if you want to, I hear you're suffering. Everybody around this time is suffering from some sort of health malady, simply because the Gilded Age diet was so heavy in fat and meat, people were getting constipated, literally sometimes to death. And so in order to cure that, they'd say, hey, you need to go to the sanitarium. Think about President Taft, the fattest president that we've ever had, got stuck in the bathtub in the White House. That's why there's a big bathtub even to this day in the White House. He goes to Kellogg to try and help him lose weight. For him, it was a little bit late. But so essentially, because of the network that Kellogg develops with these sanitariums, with his publications, his name becomes famous well outside of the Adventist context. So, and it's, if you can, there's a list in the archives at the University of Michigan of all the famous people that visited the Battle Creek Sanitarium or that Kellogg administered medical advice to, and it's expansive. So, is that kind of you answer or what you wanted me to speak on? Okay. Yeah.
You had mentioned in your list something about Kellogg and sex, and I was just kind of curious, a synopsis of his ideas.
Oh my. You sure you want this to be the last question? We can talk more out there. If anybody else has questions, we can talk more out in the lobby about this. Essentially, the idea of sex and salvation goes back to, within Christianity, it's back to St. Augustine, if we're being honest here, because Augustine dealt very heavily with the idea of eating food and the pleasures that come from that, having sex and the pleasures that come from that. And he wrote extensively on those topics. So it's something that's been in Christianity, and the idea of sex affecting your life as far as transgression and sin is there from the very beginning. Kellogg basically takes those ideas and kind of develops them in further. So with Kellogg, the most famous thing that he's probably well known for is his crusade against masturbation. And the biggest thing that he's going to implement at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, besides what I would call torture methods to keep young boys especially and women from masturbating, and I say torture because they include, say, circumcision without anesthesia on grown men and boys, the application of carbonic acid, which is a form of sulfuric acid, to the female genitalia, such as the labia and the clitoris, to keep. And again, today we would call this torture. You'd get thrown in jail for it. Back then, this was nothing out of the ordinary. In fact, people brought their children in droves to the sanitarium to keep this from happening because they believed that it would lead to them being lost and being condemned to hell. So as far as his biggest legacy in the realm of sex, I would say that Kellogg's biggest thing that he brought over was he brought over the idea of circumcision outside of the Jewish context. Until Kellogg starts circumcising people in the name of trying to get them to stop masturbating, circumcision is not practiced in the United States outside of Judaism. And circumcision does not become a health issue as far as the idea of cleanliness and things like that until 1914 with an article in the American Journal, in the American Medical Association's journal, where a doctor claims that it's healthier and that it's cleaner, more hygienic and things like that. So Kellogg's been practicing circumcision to get rid of masturbation since really the 1870s on up into the 80s. And so for all that time, circumcision is not being practiced for health reasons, it's being practiced for moral reasons. And so that's probably one of the, that's why it's cornflakes, God, and circumcision. It's probably one of the lasting legacies of Kellogg in the realm of sex. So, which is why I don't talk about it much at religious functions, although the Chapel Sabbath School over here at Keene has been wanting me to come back and talk about it. So, should be interesting and fun. So,
on that lovely note, I think we're going to give him a hand of appreciation once again.
Thank you. I asked if you wanted it to be the last one.
Thank you again. We'll be having our next lecture here on the University with the Hal Wright series, lecture series on October 2nd. Those of you that are interested in any of the Kellogg books, someone was asking me, how did you find a living temple? We were chatting before, and someone came up to me. When I was a teenager, I wanted to be an Adventist historian. I prayed, and I said, Lord, it's this really rare book, but I really like to have one. And that next morning, this lady came up to me and said, you know, my husband and I were praying. We have some old books. We saw this living temple. We prayed, what should we do with it? And we felt impressed to give it to you. So that's how I have one of these very rare copies.
I would also note that I wanted to get a hold of one, and on eBay, one sold for $1,500, and the next one that came up was $700. And I had financial benefactors, two of which, Bill and Sue Gwynn, are sitting in this audience, who gave me money, along with the late Aquila Reed, to purchase that book, which I, as I said, have in a fire safe at home.
Yeah, so if you'd like to see those or be interested in the Adventist Theological Society, stay by. We'll have a short meeting. And thank you once again so much for coming out this afternoon. Have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Really do appreciate
Sorry if I was a
That's
bit.
amazing.
Sorry if I was a bit all over the place. I wasn't
No,
gonna, I
no,
wasn't
it's-
gonna bring it up before.
Yeah.
A good friend of the family died last night from COVID.
I'm so
I
sorry.
found out early this morning. It's thrown me off all day.
Sorry, it's never. Yeah, yeah.
So, but I hope it went. I sometimes think I'm rambling and not making sense, so I hope it came